It is a real pleasure for me to be here today. I must confess to you, though, that this is actually the first time I've ever spent any length of time speaking publicly about growing up in Northern Ireland, and indeed about the 1998 peace agreement. So it's a first for me in terms of an extended dialogue or monologue initially in relation to that, and then in relation to that peace accord and its aftermath. So I want to thank you, and thank you especially, Lynn, today for asking me to do this. So with that, maybe, Jason, if you're willing to help me begin. I have a wonderful staff of many people at A&P, and they usually help me do this. So, there we go.
Share.
Wonderful.
There we go. We're all set. This is
Okay,
going to go away.
we're set to begin. This is a picture of Dunluce Castle. It's a castle perched on the coast of Ireland. It's significant in many ways. It is an ancient site, and the ruins date back. These current ruins, well, they're current and have been current for centuries. These ruins have been around since the 1400s. Prior to these ruins in this site were other ruins from the ancient kingdom of Dalriada, a kingdom that spanned the north coast of Ireland and indeed a swathe of the west of Scotland. And there are arguments in ancient history that suggest that Scotland was given its name from these ancient people that inhabited the waterways of the north coast of Ireland into even as far as the Hebrides and Argyll. This is where I come from. This scape is taken from Discover Northern Ireland, a tourist organisation. Further west in the picture, you can see just barely Portrush. There's a very good golf courses there. I think they'll be open. The Open will be held there this summer. So this coastline is known for golf. And post-peace agreement, it's also known for movie making and different things like that. I bring this picture up first because the history of Ireland is thousands of years old. Conflict has been part of Ireland and its identity for thousands of years. But if we speak to the context I came from, people would argue it really begins in the 10th century, or the 12th century actually, with the Norman invasion, firstly of England and then of Ireland through a knight called Strongbow. Now, today is not a history lesson from 1,000 years till today, so don't worry. It's just important to reference that because of the ancient tensions that have existed in that corner of Europe for a long time. What's more relevant is actually the 20th century. This is a picture of the ruins of the centre of Dublin in 1916. The First World War was a turbulent time in the history of Ireland as it was for most of Europe. In Ireland, what it did was it helped delay a civil war between Protestants and Catholics that had been brewing for decades, since the 1840s or 50s onwards. What that was about was whether Ireland should accept home rule or continue to be governed by Westminster. A rebellion in the midst of a global war, an opportunity was seen by a group of people calling themselves the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the precursor to what people may know of as the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. That became known after this, but the Irish Republican Brotherhood decided to stage a rebellion when the empire was at war. This is what that rebellion looked like, and they were defeated. But that began a period of years that led to the independence of a swathe of Ireland that became the Irish Free State, and then the Republic of Ireland as we know today, and Northern Ireland, the jurisdiction that I come from in the northeastern corner of Ireland. I have a personal story, believe it or not, to 1916 that I was told through a historical group back home. One of my great uncles was involved in the First World War, as many people here I'm sure had too. He was injured in France, sent home, back home to Northern Ireland, or Ireland as it was all one country, 32 counties at the time. During his convalescence, he was ordered to travel south to Dublin to be part of the British force that suppressed that rebellion. We'll often hear stories of the rebellion from the other side of the coin, from an Irish militant Republican side, but my family have a story to tell as well. Sadly, that great uncle would go back to France and would die a year later in a battle in France. The history of Northern Ireland itself begins really in 1922. 1916 was this rebellion. It led to an uprising and a vicious guerrilla war that led to British forces moving back into what was then becoming Northern Ireland. And then there was a civil war in Ireland before Northern Ireland, my home, appeared in 1922. Another personal story. There is a photograph that my father has at home. It was taken in 1922. It's a picture of two young men with a beautiful black car. That was my grandfather and great uncle who went off entrepreneurs to begin a family business that my father and uncle would inherit so many years later, and finally were able to retire from 2002. So my family began their business at a year when Ireland was in tremendous strife and when the 6 counties of Northern Ireland were becoming their entity on their own, breaking away from the rest of Ireland. So 1922 is significant. That was the first manifestations of what they call the Troubles. There were actually 3. First one was 1922, the second was in the 1950s, and the final one that I was born into was in the 1970s, 69 onwards. So the Troubles themselves that I experienced began before I was born, 6 months before I was born in 1969, until into, not ending, with the Belfast Agreement. The Belfast Agreement was there, but they continued well into the year 2000 and beyond, and I'll explain that later. The origins of the Troubles began in the 1960s. The 1960s in Northern Ireland saw a time of civil unrest, but actually people protesting for their civil rights. In that, they were joining people across France and across the United States. 1960s in Northern Ireland was a decade of protest. The state had been formed in the 20s. A former Prime Minister said it was a Protestant state for a Protestant people. The problem was there were a good chunk of Roman Catholics within the jurisdiction of that state. So by the 1960s, influences from outside of Northern Ireland caused people, ordinary people in Northern Ireland, Protestants and Catholics, there were Protestants involved and a number of clergy people involved in the strive for civil rights in the 60s in Northern Ireland. You can see what they want was houses, they wanted jobs, they wanted the right to vote. This came off the back of things like the Vietnam War, the Cold War, the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia, and indeed the civil rights movement in the United States. The Catholic minority left in Northern Ireland after partition wanted to have an equal status. That position led to strife from both Protestant and Catholic groups. Civil strife in the form initially of street battles that began in 1969, riots that began by both sides in the late 60s. I was born in 1970. This is an old picture of a train station. This was where I grew up, not in this train station, but in this land. Not in that train, just in have any, but actually this was what became my home. This is a picture taken many years before of a little narrow gauge railway that crisscrossed Ireland. These railway lines crisscrossed Ireland. They started in the 1800s and they closed down in the 1950s. The station master of this station retired. Him and his wife then lived in this beautiful little home. My father saw this little station and approached the station master in the late 60s and asked, could he buy it? And so my earliest memories are growing up in a little rural train station that was slowly changing to become the family home that I got used to by my teenage years and into my 20s. The train lines were there still when I was growing up. We had to dig deep down. I remember as a child digging deep and finding those train lines. The stonework was still there that Dad tried very hard to cover up. And at the end of our property, very few people had this, we had a tunnel. It was the train tunnel there in the background. You can see where the man standing behind that further was a tunnel for the train. I was born into a close, loving, and in fact, a Christian family. It was a Presbyterian family. And in a child, in many ways, I was immune to much of what was happening at the time in Northern Ireland. And some of you would have a greater idea of what was happening through media. I was growing up as a child. In 1970, I was born. I was immune to much of it. But at the same time, we were exposed to the media coverage of what was happening. The Troubles didn't immediately impinge upon us, but on reflection, there were instances where it did. And I have two recollections of this for someone growing up in a lovely train station. I have this abiding memory of my mother fearlessly taking on two heavily armed police officers. Now you say, what did she do? She wasn't doing anything. She was taking myself and my brother and sister, simply to the beach one day. Driving through bucolic, beautiful countryside, happened upon a roadblock on a corner. I remember she screeched the car and stopped. And it was only two men, two police officers, and one training their weapon on all four of us in the car for no reason. And I remember my mother getting out of the car and basically challenging this. And I can tell you that's not the first time she challenged people, either in uniform or indeed in civilian clothes wearing masks. So I can tell you that. So that gives you an insight of the respect that I have for both of my parents growing up during the time I grew up in. That's one recollection I have. It's an abiding memory. I remember then we drove on further to the coastline near Dunluce Castle and spending a wonderful day at the beach. Another instance of growing up that stands out in my I remember as a child being taken by my mother and two children that I knew, along with their mother, to I was told we were going on a road trip. That's all I was told. It was myself and two school friends, their mother, and then my mum. And my mum drove us off in our brown Viva car. Where my mother was taking us to that day was Her Majesty's Prison in McGilligan. That was changing rapidly from a United States aerodrome during the Second World War to a prison camp to house political prisoners in the 1970s. I didn't know that at the time. I was just awestruck by Second World War military stuff that the US Army had left. The sandbags, the barbed wire, the general purpose machine guns. And what we were doing was taking a family from our village to go and to see their husband, their father, who was incarcerated for political offences. I didn't know that at the time, but on reflection realised that. What stands out to me about that is something very, very simple. What people had to do then was park their car, and then a minivan or a truck would then pick up the families of inmates run by the prison service a kilometre or so away from the prison, for obvious reasons, to take those families into the prison. I remember the journey back from the prison after visiting this man. The van was just full of all women and children. And all the children except me had a toy. I sat opposite one girl with pigtails, and she had this wonderful doll's house. And I looked at it because I liked models, and I still do. And I looked, and I was empty-handed. And I remember going home and in my child's mind thinking, why did I not get a toy? Well, of course, years later, reflecting, and I've spoken about this before, I didn't need a toy because my father was at home. He was working hard. He was law-abiding, and he was safe. And we could go to the coast, to Portrush, and buy a toy any time of the day, and that's actually at times what he did. Those children were given toys that their fathers had made in prison. as a substitute for their parents not being with them. These are just maybe sensational stories. I don't know what they are to you, but they're stories that stand out for me. But unbeknownst to me in a way, I was growing up in what could be termed a rather sectarian environment in a small village in North Antrim. North Antrim is where Dunluce Castle is, and that's a significant phrase. North Antrim is a region that used to be that ancient kingdom, Scots-Irish or Ulster Scots. It was also something else. It was also a political constituency, the constituency of the Reverend Ian Paisley. Ian Paisley was the MP that I had for 30 years of my life living in Northern Ireland. That's where I come from, and that was his heartland, in a sense, for his politics, for his religious denomination, and for a lot of other things that we don't have to get into today. But I grew up in a little village, a beautiful little village that this picture here, this train station denotes. But unbeknownst to me, the culture was one, it was a predominantly Protestant village. I didn't meet any Roman Catholics until I went to grammar school. It was at grammar school I met Roman Catholics before I knew that they were, because it's something we just didn't talk about. And as I got older, I became friendly with two in particular. One recently came to visit me from Australia. He works for Qantas, and he was in Montreal on a business trip. I hadn't seen him in decades, but he was one of two Roman Catholic boys that I became friends with in my teenage years in our grammar school, so much so that they were a tremendous example to me in terms of how they studied, how they worked, but also their own Christian example. There were Roman Catholics in my grammar school. That was the founding charter of my grammar school, but it was never explicitly talked about or never identified as such. So I became aware that they were Roman Catholic by the time I was 14, 15, and then journeyed knowing that I had two close friends who were Catholic into my teenage years and then into university. I'm friendly still with one of them, and we have talked often about our experiences. And what he simply shared with me recently was, unbeknownst to me, at the edge of my village, this predominantly Protestant village, was a small Roman Catholic church that from time to time, well, let's just say it's always standing, but it has stood in different states of repair. That was his church. It's only now in our 50s that we have had a conversation about our churches and where they were. His church was actually the edge of my village, and I learned that 2-3 years ago. But they were outstanding examples to me of people and of Christian examples and of Christian experience. But yet I still did not have any type of glimpse of what people from a Roman Catholic perspective or background had. I didn't really understand. I knew what my world was in North Antrim, in our village. I sat exams, I went to church, I was involved in our family business. It was not really until the first year of university, when I went to Belfast, did I get a real experience of what the troubles for people from all over Northern Ireland felt like. I think it's safe to say that my first year in Belfast in 1988 was a year that I don't forget in a hurry. It was a bit of a roller coaster ride, and it was unpleasant at times. It was the late 1980s. I started in 1988 to read chemistry, Queen's University in Belfast. The troubles in that city were in full swing. That year in particular had been a particularly dark year in terms of trouble across the province, not centred on either Derry, Londonderry or Belfast, but across the province. And so I came to that city in the late September, the way the term fell, 1988. The tension in Belfast was palpable. That mixed with an incredibly heavy military presence, something that those of us outside of Belfast or outside of places like South Armagh or indeed Derry, we just weren't used to, in the same sense that people here would not be used to. An incredibly heavy security force presence. The student population to me seemed very radicalized. It was the first time I saw students standing for election to the student body under a Republican banner. I'd never seen that before face to face. I'd watched it on TV, but I'd never seen people, contemporaries of mine, in the lectures I sat in, standing up campaigning for a Republican agenda in our Students' Union. It was the first time that I experienced personally a bomb explosion. We all know what it's like in Hollywood. Everything happens at the same time. It doesn't. My experience was this black, unnatural plume of smoke appeared, and then just some time later, whenever that was, the noise. And if you think of your physics class, it makes sense. Light travels quicker than sound. But if you're not used to that, it's quite an experience when you realize the first time you experience an explosion in a city centre. It was the first time for other uncomfortable experiences for me. It was the first time that I witnessed a student, a friend of mine, receive the news that his uncle, and this is real time, I was with him, received the news that his uncle had been shot dead by the IRA. Now that was difficult enough as we tried to console him. He was calling home just to check in, and the news at that day was that somebody had murdered his uncle. As we gathered round to console him in the halls of residence, a cheer arose because other people at the same time received that news. Only for us it was shock, it was grief. For other people it was a note of triumph. That was particularly difficult to experience, to live through. There was something else that entire year. It was the first time in my own experience that I personally experienced intimidation because I was a Protestant. I was a Protestant on a floor, people from all over. But it was obvious when mysterious writings and graffiti were put across my door and there was damage done to my property because people knew where I came from. Even by my accent, they knew where I come from. I decided to move university, to go to a different part of the province, to go to the University of Ulster and to study, to read philosophy there, but also a kind of a complete sea change, also to become a primary school teacher. There, the student population was more international, believe it or not. There, it was more multicultural. People from all over the world went to that university. But the course that I decided to take, or much of that course, it was predominated again by Roman Catholics from Northern Ireland. I was one of a minority of Protestants during my time at the university, the 4 years I trained to be a teacher. I often look back at that time as a wonderful time in my life. It lasted for 4 years because they were some of the most intimate times I had with people who maybe lived 10, 15 miles away from me, but because we lived closely together, we shared projects, we taught in teams, we did projects together. We started to talk with each other and to share with each other what it was like to live in North Antrim, to live in Crossmaglen, to live in South Armagh, to live in Derry or Londonderry. And we started to share stories, and it began a journey for me of realizing how my life in some ways was different to people who talked like me and who looked like me, but who came from a different part of my tiny country and who had a different political persuasion and who had different influences on them than the influences I had. So it was a time of growth, a time of reaching out and understanding the need to listen to the other and to listen really to what they were saying. It was a time of dialogue. I was given a small insight into the life of people my age growing up in maybe more troubled parts of the country that I grew up in. That experience was a good experience for me then to move and begin my teaching career in Derry or Londonderry, the city where Bloody Sunday, this is a picture, it's Bishop Edward Daly, this iconic picture as a priest. He travelled through the streets in 1972 with someone who had been shot by the British Army. Bloody Sunday in that city, Bloody Sunday was known in that city. 14 people were killed. I arrived there in the middle of the 1990s, and that experience was still palpable to people in that city decades later. That was a tense place to teach in. But I saw at first-hand experience how education was invaluable in attempting to curb sectarianism amongst pupils, parents, but also teachers. Because, of course, we all bring something to the table. And the experience I had through a program called Education for Mutual Understanding in Northern Ireland, as teachers, it was all mandatory for us to do this, to engage with our own communities, but then to reach out to schools that were predominantly from another background, and to do projects together, either play soccer or football or writing projects. We were involved in creative writing projects with people coming from parts. In that case, for me, it was the waterside in Derry, reaching out to the city side, predominantly Roman Catholic part of Derry, housed places like the Bogside and Cregan, these places that people may know about if they know anything about the history of Northern Ireland. It was there that I was able to connect with people who came from Republican backgrounds, but not in a hidden, aggressive way, but in an open way that we could dialogue. People who were willing, in one instance or in two instances, were willing to allow me to be taken in a car across from where I lived, across the Craigavon Bridge, into what I believed was the Cregan. I didn't know, but I was told to go into one of these little houses, to sit down in a place with as many people as is gathered here today, to experience a Christian worship service held by people who had come out of what they thought was the Roman Catholic Church into what was a fellowship church, but it was populated by people from the west of that city, people from these no-go areas, from Northern Ireland in the late 60s, early 70s, people who for sure had connections to people who traditionally would have been enemies to the people I come from. I was ignored in both occasions. I came, I sat down. They chose to speak in Irish. They worshipped in Irish. They dialogued in Irish. The first time. The second time, they spoke, but they didn't speak to me. They spoke to each other. But they spoke to each other about their experience living in places like the Cregan, like the Bogside, the difficulties, the poverty, the tension, the violence. And that was a message to me, over my head, but it was actually to me, to say, this is who we are. That was an outstanding experience for me. I've never forgotten the trust that was someone whom I knew took me into that environment to experience that and to hear from that perspective, that story that was not my story or my experience. I was in that city when President Bill Clinton came to speak to the Guildhall. We were given a day off. That's mostly why I remember it, but he came along with John Hume, who then was given the Nobel Peace Prize. I was there in the city at that time that he came to speak in the build-up to what would become the peace agreement, the Belfast Accord. It's known as different ways. But prior to or after the Belfast Agreement, something awful happened. I was also teaching in that city when a bomb planted by dissident Republicans killed 29 people in a town called Omagh, a market town just south of Derry, where I taught. In August 1998, this happened a few months after the Belfast Agreement was signed. It happened after that. I was polishing my car that day. It was an August day, but it was grey enough that I could get a good shine in my car. And I was polishing my car, my radio was on, and as came across, there had been an incident and a number of people had been injured. But then as time went on, the newscaster changed their vocabulary and everybody in Northern Ireland knew what that meant. It was summertime, so I was off school. But I remember thinking about my colleagues and my friends in Londonderry, thinking how many of them might have been affected. At that point, I had no idea if any of my colleagues had been injured or hurt, or if their relations or friends had been injured or hurt in that horrendous attack. It was only years later was I told by a very close friend that my other close friend, his wife, had lost her aunt. And I can tell you this was years later that I was told that my friend's aunt was lost, and lost completely in that explosion. But a few months before that horrendous event, something else happened in Northern Ireland. The agreement, the Belfast Agreement, before the Omagh bomb, was the Good Friday Peace Accord. It was signed by a number of politicians, well-known politicians. This was a tentative deal after decades of a number of initiatives that failed. There was the Sunningdale Agreement, there was the Anglo-Irish Agreement, a number of these different things through my life. The Good Friday Peace Accord gripped world attention because of who was involved. It was an agreement that finally brought the then Unionist Party, the largest Unionist party at the time, to the table, along with Sinn Féin, the political end of the IRA. At that stage it was, and we all knew it was, brought these groups together along with many other parties to try to hammer out a peace accord that would bring an end to that needless violence that dominated that corner of Ireland for so long. What that peace accord signed off on was the following. It promised a new governing body, power sharing, something that had been promised before. It promised proper Protestant and, importantly, proper Roman Catholic representation politically, to end the gerrymandering, to end the dominant, the zero-sum game, to give both parties, both groups in Northern Ireland, an equal stake in their future. It promised a new policing force, which was controversial amongst the Protestant community. It promised the decommissioning of weapons. And then it promised, after the policing, the change in policing, something that was more controversial. It promised the early release of political prisoners. And amongst the Protestant community, that was incredibly controversial, because people felt that these people were properly, justly put away. And in some cases, they were put away for some horrendous crimes, and within a matter of 2-3 years, they were released again. That was the most controversial aspect of that agreement. But I guess it was something that the politicians of the day felt they had to do to win the peace and to ensure that groups like Sinn Féin were on side. In a subsequent referendum called the Belfast Agreement, as it became known, that was approved by nearly 72% of the population of Northern Ireland. I was one of that 72% that voted for that initiative. Like many people, I believed it was the only option we had, because I had lived through all the other failed attempts at trying to bring together the different factions within that province. I remember, though, being asked openly how I voted after I left the polling station. Now, that's something that, can I advise you in a few days' time not to answer. I was asked openly how I voted. And that was the day that I learned to lie convincingly. You see, North Antrim, the constituency I came from, and I knew this, was a no constituency. Overwhelmingly, that parliamentary constituency voted against that agreement. It was simply out of self-preservation that day. Maybe I should have said yes, what I voted, and was honest, but that day, because of who I was answering to, I didn't tell the truth. So I openly admit that. Maybe that's why it's taken me decades to speak about Northern Ireland, because I lied. But I did so, I think, for the proper reasons at the time. The area that I came from had a reputation for being anti-agreement. The 72% of the electorate who voted yes included the overwhelming majority of pro-Irish nationalist and Republican voters, but it only included 51% of the British Unionist/Loyalist voters, and I was one of that 51% in a constituency that voted no. Few Protestants in North Antrim at that time voted for that agreement. Culturally and historically, I come from Unionist stock. I'm sure you've ascertained that as a Presbyterian minister from Northern Ireland, being supported by the Protestant Benevolent Society. It makes sense. There were and still are deep divisions among certain aspects of that community in Northern Ireland today to that Belfast Agreement that was signed decades ago. And as a result, even 27 years since the signing of the agreement, progress on its implementation has been, let's say, it's like the crest and the trough of a wave. It comes and goes. There have been any number of attempts at implementing the mechanisms for power sharing. Successful in some instances, other times it hasn't been. And to this day, certain loyalist groups have not decommissioned their weapons. I know that the decommissioning is close to the hearts of many Canadians because of General Jean de Chastelain. The Republican movement, by and large, tried to decommission their weapons, but you have to remember these are guerrilla groups. They don't keep records of pretty much anything. And so there had to be a rough estimate of the weapons that they decommissioned. But to my knowledge, I may be wrong on this, the majority of loyalists either did give them up, but in some instances they definitely did not. And that's still the case to this day, as well as dissident groups, Republican groups. They still exist some decades after the Good Friday Agreement. Anti-agreement parties still run and still gain support. There is a small anti-agreement party. They are now the dominant party in the constituency that I come from, even so many decades after that peace agreement. Still, within Northern Ireland, there are rumours and allegations of collaboration between the state and different murder gangs from both Republicans and Loyalist sides. It's not one or other, it's both. And allegations of collusion with the state. That's still trundling on. There are still families who reach out and seek justice. They feel that the books have not been closed as to why their loved one was murdered in the way that they were murdered. Why were they murdered? Now, these are situations I can't speak to. I'm just aware that they still exist. And today, 27 years after that agreement was signed, Sinn Féin is the dominant party in Northern Ireland. The First Minister is First Minister O'Neill, Michelle O'Neill from County Tyrone. Sinn Féin, the former party, the political end of the Republican movement, the other end being the IRA. And both of those wings of that movement were answerable decades ago to the Army Council of the IRA. We have to believe that that is now over, and Sinn Féin stands alone. That's indeed what Sinn Féin means, we alone. We hope and pray that Sinn Féin means we alone in terms of its influence today as a political party, but it is the dominant political party in Northern Ireland today, and because it is an Irish party, it fields politicians both north and south of the border, so it has TDs, the equivalent of MPs in the Republic, as well as members of Parliament in the constituencies in the north. I can personally testify to aspects of where the Belfast Agreement did not complete its work. And when I say that, that is in no way meant to be a criticism of those involved in that agreement. I think that the politicians, the years leading up to 97, did a wonderful job. They did what they could do in the time frame that they had. And if you think of those people who were involved, the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the Taoiseach of the Republic of Ireland. And I am sure all three of those people could have had other things to do. So this is in no way by means a criticism of the agreement. It's just pointing out at a grassroots level aspects that maybe politics cannot resolve in Northern Ireland. I want to give you just a personal recollection just 2 years after when the agreement was signed. I was about to go to seminary in the August of 2000. It was a beautiful time, beautiful hazy weather that sometimes in Ireland it can be. One Sunday morning, I was asleep about 6 o'clock in the morning, about then a couple of hours later to get up and go to church. I had moved from where I'd been teaching in Londonderry back to stay with my parents for the remaining 2 weeks before I would head off to New Jersey and begin what I thought would be a short time before I would return to Northern Ireland as a Presbyterian minister. About 6 o'clock in the morning, there was a rap on my window, and it's my dad. "Glenn, wake up." He said, "Glenn, there is a bomb at the end of our lane." This was sensational because we had never experienced such a thing. It wasn't actually at the end of our lane. It was at the end of our property. It was quite a long lane, then a cattle grid, and then the village began. Our village began at the end of our property, and just we could see there's a little house. You turned a corner of the little house, and what Dad was meaning was somebody had left a hold-all, and in that hold-all was a device it left on someone's doorstep. Dad went down to investigate something he shouldn't have done, and a soldier appeared from nowhere and summarily told him to turn and walk back up into his house. So he came and he knocked my window. What that was the beginnings of a loyalist feud in that village and in other villages in predominantly Protestant parts of Northern Ireland, and indeed in the urbanized areas, as these groupings decided or tried to reinvent themselves or rediscover who they were. And on an occasion, since the signing of the Belfast Agreement, this aspect of life in Northern Ireland has reared its ugly head. In areas that never experienced significant levels of violence to be recorded, including my village and the town that I was born in. That's a personal experience upon about to leave Northern Ireland to get a flight from Shannon Airport to go and spend time and train to be a minister. So with the change, and I'm beginning to conclude, with the change in the political landscape in Northern Ireland and serious consideration today to a border poll, that was part of the peace agreement. But there's now more a reality of a border poll than there could have been in the past because of who is in power in Northern Ireland at the moment. A border poll between North and South in Ireland for people to vote. Should there be a border or should there not? There's now a closer reality to that than there's ever been before. With that, the change in the political landscape, how unionists need to try and reinvent themselves. That's not my words. It's what political commentators in Ireland are saying. And the election results. With Brexit, and also now with tariffs from the United States of America, there seems to be once again a context where Northern Ireland is in somewhat of a precarious situation. However, to conclude, because of my own experiences growing up there and also being involved in different things in different parts of the world, and also my belief system as a Christian, I'm a Presbyterian minister, and surely I have to weave that somewhere into this discussion. It's what I do as a Christian. I am committed to the notion that people from all sides in Northern Ireland have much more in common with each other than they have differences. They live cheek by jowl with each other, live side by side with each other. This commonality begins with bitterness, hatred, bigotry, guilt, fear, and grief. And that has to be recognized. These are the commonalities that people in Northern Ireland share. And these are carried by all sections of that community. There's no one section or one political ideology has a monopoly on suffering in Northern Ireland. Even though at times you would have heard growing up this toing and froing, this, somebody was killed, and then another group says, yeah, but someone from my group was killed. I grew up with that. There's no monopoly on who suffers. Everybody in a conflict suffers. Nobody wins in a conflict. Suffering is carried by all members of that community. This commonality, however, is also manifest in the need to trust each other and in the need to have faith and forgive each other. I often look to the experience of South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and what happened there. History will tell us if that group were able to achieve lasting peace in South Africa. But to my knowledge, Any mechanism such as that has never occurred in my own country. And that maybe is one reason why people still to this day go to the High Court with a picture of a loved one that they lost 50 years ago and ask the questions, why? Potentially that's maybe something that needs added to the politics of the Good Friday Agreement. But this commonality is also embodied in that agreement and in what those politicians were able to do for the population of Northern Ireland. Without question, there are people still in politics there today who see the advantage to talk about a them and an us society, to talk about traditions and heritage and whatever flag we should fly. There are people today in Northern Ireland still adhere to that. They still adhere to a them and us society, a zero-sum game, a win-lose paradigm. There's people there who still get votes and still campaign on those types of sentiments. But I believe that time has and will change that. It already has begun to change it. But time will continue to change that attitude so that people can fully embrace the traits and the aspirations of the Belfast Agreement. Just to conclude, I brought a picture up of the Europa Hotel. The Europa Hotel is a hotel in Belfast that actually stands for human resilience, for ingenuity, for bravery, and for hope. It kind of symbolises the aspirations of many people in Northern Ireland. The Europa Hotel was built in 1971. Between 33 and 36 attempts were made during 3 decades to destroy it, and on many occasions it was destroyed. So the picture I showed you a few slides back about Belfast, if you remember the one about the carnage of the truck and the damage, that was actually the Europa Hotel during the Troubles. And that's what the Europa Hotel looks like today. There were 33 bomb explosions in the Europa Hotel. It was once acclaimed the most bombed hotel in the world. I don't know if it still has that reputation, but Hannah and I were able to celebrate my 50th birthday in the Europa Hotel a few years ago. That hotel stands for resilience, it stands for endurance, it stands for hope, and it stands for that human desire to seek for justice and not give in. And I hope it stands as a beacon. I want to conclude today by a mentor of mine who was a moderator of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, and I had a tremendous privilege of being the stated supplier, the locum, the stand-in, the substitute for him the year that he became moderator in the year 2000. And I want to end with this quote, which I think encapsulates what I believe about the context I come from. He said this to a room filled with Presbyterians. As we plan for the future, there ought to be no political traditions that we will not question, no cultural customs that we will not challenge, no sacred cows that we will not sacrifice, so that this generation and the generations to follow will not only see a shared vision and a shared future, but will actually live into that future together. Now that's something I paraphrased that because it was set in a church, but it's a statement that he made. I think it really summarizes where I'm coming from and what this talk was for me today. So thank you.